I'm Aaron Wolf. I'm a FUTO. I'm here with Glenn Greenwald. So, at FUTO, we're here to, try to mitigate the harm that the tech oligopoly is causing. And one of those is absolutely the censorship that we've seen, become rampant in the last, 4 or 5 years. So thanks for being here, Glenn.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
You were one of the pioneers in blogging back in the mid 2000s. You had a blog on Blogspot.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, and then Google would pick you up in search results, and like you reached a huge audience that way. So you benefited a lot from I was an engineer at Yahoo back in in the early 2000s. So that was what we wanted. We wanted to build stuff for people like you to reach their audience, and it worked out well for a time. I mean, maybe you want to elaborate on kind of how you saw it.
Well, yeah, I joined what, in a kind of very cringe way, in retrospect, was called the blogosphere, because it had influenced me first. I was a reader of it and a consumer of it before becoming a participant in it. And it was incredibly valuable because at the time, in those early 2000s, there was a kind of repression that grew out of the 9/11 attack that naturally arises whenever a country feels besieged by a foreign enemy. And there was less dissent in mainstream media discourse permitted. Obviously, that was one of the major reasons the Iraq War was allowed to happen based on false pretenses, was because there was very little questioning of the government's claims and propaganda. And so this kind of independent sector of what became the media, which was people who weren't media professionals, hadn't gone to Columbia Journalism School, had never worked at the New York Times, instead were just kind of informed citizens who had very well-developed critiques, and often very virulent critiques, of mainstream media institutions, were able to reach first on their own a kind of large audience because there were so many other people similarly disenchanted, and there was no intervention on the part of Google or other big tech companies. Quite the contrary, as you said, the intention at the time was to develop tools to enable people to communicate with one another without the interference by the government or by large corporations. And that was the model that grew out of Silicon Valley. I think it was kind of a libertarian ideology that drove it in the beginning, and it succeeded. It's what reached me and ultimately began changing my thinking about how I understood the world, and then motivated me to go one day very spontaneously with no plan and just click create blog on what was Google's platform called Blogspot, free platform. And you just created a blog, and if you were writing things that people were interested in, you were able to find an audience, in part because other bloggers would promote your work, but also because Google itself would do so. And there were a lot of times I would write about something, and if I Googled that topic, maybe the first result would be the New York Times, and the second would be NBC News, and the third or the fourth would be mine. And it was a very egalitarian playing field that enabled me to find a large audience despite having the backing of no media corporation. That's one of the reasons I value that freedom so much.
Yeah, right. I mean, I remember in 2004, 2003, Yahoo was just incredibly focused on the fact that Google was eating our lunch for search. So both companies, we had capitalism working the way it was supposed to. We had two companies, we had a couple others too, that were fiercely competing. And the only job they saw was to connect people doing searches with relevant content. That's all they wanted to do.
I think that the ethos of the internet, and I remember going, back to the mid 90s, which is the first time I encountered the internet. I began using these political debate forums inside of these walled off communities of CompuServe and AOL that were thriving and stimulating because they were different, precisely because their anonymity allowed a kind of greater mental freedom, that you knew the things you were writing weren't connected on your permanent record to your name, and it enabled people to express themselves with a kind of greater amount of just freedom and individuality. I think when people know that they're being monitored, and there's psychological studies that demonstrate this, it's the reason I regard the right of privacy as so important. their behavior becomes much more conformist, becomes the byproduct of societal expectations and orthodoxies rather than autonomy and agency. And it's always in the realm of privacy, when you can say things and do things without, the judgmental eyes of other people being cast upon you. That's where dissent and creativity and individuality flourishes, really where it exclusively resides. And that was the ethos of the internet at the beginning. And even once these large corporations like Google and Yahoo started to develop it and exploit it, there was still no sense that they were doing so with the intention of allowing it to be controlled, let alone censored. It was to empower and liberate. And that was the early model.
Right. I mean, that's exactly what we wanted. So you wound up working with more traditional journalism for a bit, right? And then you wound up, now today you're on primarily on Substack, right?
Yeah, it's kind of come full circle.
Has it come full circle? Like, is Substack for you, is it as free as it was back in 15 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. When I was blogging, I started finding a way to make a living, which is simply by relying once a year on the donations of readers who were donating based on the idea that they wanted me to be able to continue to do that work and not have to go work for large media corporations. And then because I had a large audience and that became the currency in the digital age of media companies, they knew they needed individuals with large followings to bring their audience to those sites, because it started to become very much based on a traffic model rather than just relying on traditional advertiser relationships. I always conditioned my willingness to go work for them, first at Salon and then The Guardian. Into my contract was written the explicit right that I had, which is very unusual, almost unprecedented actually, that I would be able to publish directly to the internet without editorial interference unless I requested it. So for me, and then when I obviously left The Guardian to start The Intercept and create it, I didn't do it in order to impose more restrictions on myself. I did it to preserve that freedom, not just for myself, but for other people. So in each of those contracts was written that freedom. So I always had the same kind of full editorial autonomy and journalistic independence that I had going all the way back to that little blog of mine. But the problem became that the more you attach yourself to an institution and become the spokesperson for it, or you become dependent on a particular political faction, the more this kind of censorship and repression starts to seep into your brain in a kind of subliminal way. You may not even be aware of the ways in which you're being constrained. And it was only once I left The Intercept and returned to a fully independent model, which is Substack, where it's a very similar model to what I was relying on in 2005, in the sense that I rely on, it's not now donations, it's subscriptions, but it's the same thing. It's my readership willingly paying for my work, and they're essentially the only boss I have. It's where most of my income comes from. And it will work and is working only to the extent that Substack and its founders and managers remain committed to this model of refusing to capitulate to societal pressure, and especially from liberal establishments that they deplatform people deemed unsuitable to be heard. And so far, Substack has been impressively defiant in doing so. But Substack still hasn't quite grown into the magnitude of a media player that they need to in order for us to really know how committed they are to resisting that.
Yeah, but I mean, the nice thing with Substack is, since you own I think we're in an okay situation with Substack than we are with other things like Twitter and YouTube, because at least with Substack, you have a list of all your followers, and if Substack ever did try to deplatform you, you could email them all. Hopefully you're saving a copy of that somewhere.
Yeah, of course. I mean, the reason I trust Substack is because I've gotten to know the founders and the managers, and I believe they are deeply committed, not just in a kind of branding way or because it's in their commercial self-interest, but because they see it as a cause in which they genuinely believe, to create Substack as one of the now several platforms that really is designed above all else to give writers the ability to write freely without having to be worried about deplatforming. And that depends, again, on their willingness to do so. The problem, and things like ensuring that you own your own subscriber list and your email list is one of the ways they've done that, to ensure essentially that even if you do end up deplatformed for whatever reason, as you say, you still have the most valuable asset, which is the direct relationship with your audience. The problem with all of these places and with the internet in general is that even if you have a particular platform devoted to resisting these kinds of pressures, there are other points of vulnerability, other services on which they rely, whether it be credit card processors, which in the case of Substack is Stripe, or cloud services or hosting services, all of which become their own individual points of vulnerability.
Right.
And that activists, censorship advocates like Sleeping Giants and other groups are now starting to target on purpose to kind of get around these companies like Rumble, like Substack, that are giving them the middle finger for the moment, to find other ways to force the deplatforming of people they want to be silenced.